All right. Welcome to Gateway API meeting for May 12th. I've been out for a while, so apologies if I missed anything. I'm going to be catching up throughout all this. This is my first day back in a bit more than a week. Um, yeah, I don't know if I got the date right. I know our deadline is not on a Friday. Yeah, it is on a Tuesday yeah, on a Tuesday, and our deadlines have generally been the end of day Pacific. I don't know why end of day Pacific. It's kind of
That's what
unstated.
you are.
Random
Yeah,
is
yeah. So center of center of the universe, clearly. But yeah, we can choose a different time. I generally things if it's May 20 somewhere, I think you're okay uh, at this point. We're not trying to be too particular. It's just at some point we really need to have a cutoff, and especially for scoping, what we're defining here is trying to make sure every proposal that gets in. If you're waiting until the last minute to get your proposal in, the chances that you're not going to accrue enough votes to get um, any significant traction, unfortunately, just because, yeah, votes accrue over time. So with standard channel, I think anyone proposing anything to graduate to standard is probably going to get a lot of support because we really, really want to get things across the line to standard. So thank you to Candace for proposing backend TLS policy and to Lior for proposing supported features. I think both of these are going to be very well supported and well needed. I think there's more lingering here that we are missing right now, and I think we're missing it because we just have not had people volunteering to take on the additional work in this cycle. But some examples features that could fit in are HTTP route retries. I don't know if Mike or I know Flynn can't make it to this call.
Yeah, I'm here.
Uh,
I'll go.
Sorry, did you say that's something that's on your radar for this release?
Yeah, I just haven't posted
Okay.
it.
Okay, so HTTP route retries. The other one, sorry, I've got is gateway client cert validation. I think this actually moved over to experimental because Arco proposed changes to the scope instead of trying to take it direct to GA. Um, and the other one on my radar is something that has sat around long enough and could make it across is session persistence. I don't know uh, if anyone has this on their radar yet, though, but that would be a nice one if someone exists. Um, cool. Okay. So and then experimental, there's been a lot of good discussion here. Um, yeah. Uh, so Shane added this discussion. We have 9 comments right now, so 9 top level proposals. I know there are more on the way. I know that like from Google side, we don't have all the things we want to propose yet, and I know there's already a lot of other solid proposals in here. Um, Yeah, so just please, a reminder, please take a look at this, leave some comments, add some votes. I see there are some cases where there are more upvotes than emoji reactions. Really appreciate seeing emoji reactions because that helps avoid brigading, well, not avoid, but make it more obvious if all the upvotes came from one particular project, for example. Um, yeah, and yeah, I think that's all to say about this release, but that means we're basically 1 week away from this deadline. So please, if you've got something, try and get those proposals in this week, so that we're not
Earlier
just
rather than later, again, as Rob said,
yeah.
because we do the votes and emoji reactions are a significant chunk of how we order those things.
Yeah.
So yeah. Mike asked in the chat about session persistence in backend LB policy or backend traffic policy, Rob.
Yeah, so we actually removed backend LB policy. So backend traffic policy is the only path forward at this point. So that's going to be a little funny, because if it does move forward, that would be kind of a fast graduation of backend traffic policy, but it's basically a renamed existing policy, at least the thing that would graduate. But yeah, it is a little funny.
Yeah, that just might be tricky, is we want to make sure that we have implementations that are implemented
Yeah,
in the backend traffic
yeah,
policy variant.
yeah, for sure.
Rob, just a quick question. You said we removed the backend LB policy? It's not
Renamed, but
renamed to backend traffic policy, or?
yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah, let me write that out for future. Cool. All right. Yeah, I think that's everything. Any other comments or thoughts on 1.4? Oh, one other thing, Candace, not to put you on the spot, or sorry to put you on the spot. The blog post, have you been able to start any kind of draft for that yet?
Yes, I have a draft, and I've been assigned a review buddy
Oh, awesome.
as of a couple of days ago.
Cool.
I can put the draft up here. Let me just find it.
Yeah.
And I've only gotten to really describe the percentage-based request mirroring,
Yeah.
and the course filter a little bit. Other things I still need to do, but there's some
No, that's
some
great.
stuff there.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for leading that. That is amazing. And then I think the last thing I wanted to talk about is, I know there's been a lot of comments, and I have not done a good job at paying attention to that. Well, I've tried to read this, but I feel like especially having gone on vacation, I have lost some of the context here. Nick, I think you left the most recent comment. Are you able to do a quick
Yeah,
recap of how we got to this?
So I think at the moment, John has some design objections to how we attach backend TLS policy to service. I don't really understand his objections, which is why I've put a couple of comments on there, asking for him to clarify it. I think the impression that I get is that he doesn't like that it attaches to service, and that makes how it should behave in non-north-south context a little bit unclear. I'm not exactly sure what he would prefer to do instead. I feel like maybe he wants to just have it inside HTTP route or inside gateway. So that's why I've asked him to say, like, what do you want instead? What would resolve your issues? He's on leave, so for a couple of weeks, so we're probably not going to get anything from him for a little bit. Mike wrote a really great comment here about sort of summarizing where things are at. But like looking at John left a comment this morning that I only just saw. It does seem like John wants to come back, and John still has objections here. So Mike, you want to take over?
Yeah, so I think I understand some of John's concerns about the like attaching to service and the ambiguity of that. And I tried to capture some of that scope. There's another issue that somebody else opened, suggesting the addition of like insufficient skip verify that gets into more of the awkward UX around the like, do we actually have the procedures right for this?
So the other thing that I've been meaning to do is to write down like why we picked service originally, which basically comes down to you need to put this somewhere that the person who owns the application, this whole thing is not about configuring TLS in every possible situation. This thing is about, just to be clear for everyone else listening, this is about configuring TLS for folks who are doing their own TLS already inside their application. And so that's the application owner, that's Anna. And so we need to be able to have Anna be able to say, I am doing my own TLS inside my application. And so we need a resource that is owned by Anna to be the place where we represent this. That means we have two options. We have either the service or the HTTP route. We cannot do this in Gateway because Anna does not own Gateway. So if we do it in HTTP route, the options are that you do it at the top level of a HTTP route, which doesn't make sense because this is a per backend thing. You may have different backends have different properties, which means that if you don't do it at the top end in HTTP route, the only place to do it is at the backend ref. If we do it at the backend ref, that means that for every time you refer to this service, you will need to specify this again, right? And so that means that you will, if you don't do it with a policy attached to the service, and we do it inside the HTTP route inside the backend ref, then that means that you will have to specify this every time the thing is referred. I will put a comment to that effect to say this is why we did it with service, right? And as I said, I still don't understand. Like, yes, it is a bit unclear, but it is completely within our rights to say backend TLS policy does not apply to mesh use cases, right? Like, it's not for that problem because, as John says, in a mesh, if you have a program that's doing its own TLS and you try to do automatic TLS on it, you're going to be doing double TLS, which is kind of dumb, right? Like, it's like, it doesn't make sense. And so so I will put another comment on there just explaining some of the history here so that when John does come back, he has the context. And so that, then we can have a slightly more productive discussion about this. Candace, over to you.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that although I didn't clearly articulate it in my comments here, we've discussed this in my team outside of this team, and we've determined that we probably need to open up an issue that talks about the actual Gamma service connection definition is problematic. Because we don't think that everybody is implementing it in the same way. I think it was Shane mentioned that Linkerd does require HTTP routes. And John, I think, was saying that there's lots of situations where we don't require HTTP routes.
Yeah, they're definitely not required.
Linkerd needs them, and they do use them. So Flynn's not here today, but we did want to involve him in the conversation. So I'm going to open up a discussion related to that. I don't know if we should close this particular discussion first.
This is slightly orthogonal in that but both of them are talking about service attachment. We did talk a lot about attaching to service like at the beginning of Gamma. I think everyone acknowledged that there are definite problems with using service as the attachment point for HTTP route, but that as many people say about democracy, it's terrible, but it's the best thing we got. And it's the same with service attachment here for HTTP route. Like, everyone acknowledged that it's not ideal, but it was the best that we have. And the feedback at the time was that this is how people are already using mesh, and this is what people are using mesh for, and so that's why Gamma went ahead with using service attachment. So I think it's completely fair for you to open a similar issue to say like, hey, can we explain why, here's some issues we have with this. I think that more than likely there probably does need to be some more like specification around that for sure. But yeah, the right way to do that is to open another discussion issue. But again, that is slightly orthogonal for this one. Sorry, Mike.
I'm happy to clarify anything in the specification, or like if there's conformance gaps, I'm happy to work with Leo on that to kind of clarify the gamma functionality there.
Yeah, so I think I can say pretty confidently that there is conformance gaps. You know, like we had a bunch of conformance problems on Cilium that I had to fix with our own tests. It's on my list to bring some of those tests to upstream. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, no, and I think, at least as far as Mesh is concerned, Leo's been working a lot to close conformance gaps there, which is great. Yeah, I think, you know, I can't pretend to have as much context as Nick or Mike or Candace, who have been more involved in this thread than I am. But my takeaway here is really severalfold. I don't want to. Backend TLS has been likely the most controversial and challenging topic in the history of Gateway API. Not to be, but you know, it's just taken so long to get across the line, and we've had so many challenges finding the right way to express it. At least part of that is it's a really complex topic, and part of it is it's difficult to represent in Gateway's model, and everyone has their own way of, you know, dealing with TLS. I think another real challenge here is that Mesh's view of MTLS is decidedly different than a north-south implementation of an MTLS. So this is really putting the ideas of Gateway API, that you can use the same APIs for north, south, and east, west, to a test, right? It's a real challenge where, you know, routing has been really simple because, yeah, you can use routes north, south, east, west. It mostly works. The service attachment is weird, but, you know, whatever. It's the least bad thing we have. My take on this is I want to. I think it's, Nick mentioned this in one of his comments. It is overdue that we have a way to solve this in Gateway API. It is, you know, it is such a critical feature to so many users, and it's something like that Ingress Nginx has a way to support. For example, we're trying to encourage Ingress Nginx users to migrate to Gateway API. It's one of many reasons we should try to get this to GA, and I'd like to get it to GA very soon. I would like to, you know, my only pause here is I want to see a way that whatever we graduate could work with Mesh, or could clearly not, and we're saying that Mesh is just forever not in scope, or, you know, whatever, right? Like I think that's more ambiguous than I'd like right now. I think what we've said right now is it is out of scope for Mesh. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I think there's a little more nuance than that.
Okay.
What I really want to avoid is like special casing things saying like this does not apply to Mesh. I am very much okay if we define the scope of backend TLS policy such that it is applicable to application code only, or something like that, or like that's what I was trying to do, like in my comment here, is define the scope such that a special exception is not needed. It's just, it is for this use case, and if that use case, if applied to a mesh, breaks, then that's okay. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. What I want to avoid is saying, oh, it's out of scope for now, but we have this thing that if and when you try to use it for mesh, then it breaks. Like, I want the breaking or incompatibility to be known up front. Basically, like defining the scope, clarity on the behavior, and if that does not solve the mesh use cases, and we need something else for that, I think that's okay.
Yep.
I want to remove this like, oh, but maybe it does mesh in the future thing, because
Yeah, I agree.
This thing.
It should not have. There should not be a maybe it does mesh in the future caveat. Like it should be
We need
either
to-
it does it or it doesn't. And if it does, then it does it in this very limited set of cases or something like that, right? Like
that's what I think we really need to define to get it to GA is like what the actual mesh behavior is, and not like an asterisk, maybe it works in the future.
Yeah, like, and I think the thing that I've struggled with all along is that, you know, I feel like a lot of the folks who are using mesh are like, but why would you want to do that? And I'm like, people do. Like, you know, that's the, you know, like people are like, but why would you want to do that when you have a service mesh to do TLS for you? And I'm like, people do. People use Spring Boot that builds TLS for you automatically. People have a bunch of other automated frameworks that are, or that legacy applications that they're moving things in that does its own TLS. Is it a good idea when you have a mesh? No, it's a completely, you know, it's silly to do it when you have a mesh, right? Like when you have a mesh to do it for you, it makes way more sense. But like a lot of people aren't using a service mesh, and those people need a way to make sure that the communication between the gateway and the back end is TLS. Like, and that's why I get a bit frustrated, is because it's like I've tried to say all the way along, this is not for mesh. Like it will break when you do mesh with it, because the use case is breaking the mesh assumptions, right? Like which the mesh assumptions are the traffic that leaves that enters the final application container of an application is not TLS, because mesh is supposed to do the TLS for you. Like that's one of the basic assumptions of mesh, is that mesh handles TLS for you, and this violates that basic assumption. And so, yeah, like I said, what I want to do is I want to sort of put down here is the design process like we went through to get to service attachment. If you want to do something else, then you have to sort of meet the same requirements that we met with service attachment in some other way. The other thing that I think is very relevant here, and I'll hand back over to you in a sec, Mike, is that there is a pretty obvious like use case adjacent thing for mesh, that is, how do you take one of these things that does its own TLS and make it so that it works with the mesh, which then ties back to the thing that Flynn was working on about how do you tie a gateway into a mesh and make the gateway participate in the mesh and give the gateway a mesh identity. So it's similar in many respects to that, but like this is, again, it's not sort of, this is kind of intended to be I'm not interested in migrating to the mesh, or I don't have a mesh at all kind of use case, right? Like rather than this is a way to bridge you into the mesh temporarily while you get your stuff figured out. Yeah. So Mike.
Yeah. So like that all makes sense. And just like putting aside mesh at all for a moment. The other issue that somebody else opened sometime last week was around adding insecure skip verify support backend TLS policy. And I think even for the north-south use case, that it starts to feel awkward, and I think it brings to the foreground some of John's concerns. I
mean, I think
I hadn't really been paying attention to before. So
I think part of the problem here is that we haven't been clear enough that backend TLS policy is not about client settings. It is about server settings. It is about the stuff that is with ANA's control, not the stuff that is with whoever is connecting to ANA's service control, right? Like, so people
okay.
to put,
if that's the case, then I'm okay with that. What the feedback here would be is it would be awkward and inappropriate for backend TLS policy to try to force client configurations of some sort because of discoverability issues, as well as just like that's the thing a client needs to decide. And if we're having a service producer reconfiguring clients that are connecting to it, that is weird.
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated because already some of the stuff that we have in there is kind of client adjacent, in that we say, hey, this is the CA bundle you need to use to connect to this. So like it's, like that is a thing that the client could conceivably use to do it, but equally it's also a thing that the server needs to provide as part of connecting to
that was the other thing, is right now the like client CA bundle thing is worded as override, which I don't know if that's just maybe not worded accurately, but if it is, then that's applying some like serious access discoverability issues across like all names.
It's because there's a way to define it on a gateway as well.
Yeah,
is
yeah.
my-
So I know the gateway definition, and that's the one that makes a lot of sense to me. It's that if it is actually overriding that, then that requires visibility into those resources across in whatever namespace the service exists.
At the end of the day, again, it comes back to like I guess like I do feel a bit frustrated because like I feel like I've tried to say this like 20 different ways, and I feel like every time I find a new way to say it that people are like, oh, now I understand what you mean. But like the whole thing is about Anna being able to say, I'm doing my own TLS, and this is what you need to know to be able to connect to me, right? Like, and so some of that is stuff that kind of is client settings, like here is the CA bundle that you need to be able to trust, right? Like, so it's up to the client whether or not they take that CA bundle and just blindly use it, or if they, look at that CA bundle and like check it to see if it's one that they already have that they also trust, or if they just ignore it and try and connect anyway and have it fail, right? Like, and so because if you don't trust the CA, then you won't be able to complete a TLS handshake. It's one of the reasons I've resisted putting stuff like, I resisted putting SANs and things in there, because those are kind of like, this is what you should use to connect. You should use this host name to connect. That's a client setting, not a server setting, right? Like, and so I've always biased this in my mind towards being a server settings thing rather than a client settings thing. I guess, again, I haven't made that more clear enough because I haven't used that specific terminology. And again, it just goes to show how much in TLS it's important that you use extremely specific terminology, because people will be like, oh, I didn't realize that that's what you meant, because I thought the word that you were using meant something else, because that's how I think of TLS.
So
Sorry.
are you making a case for us calling this server TLS policy?
Sure. Like, I mean, if that's going to make it clearer for people, then like in this, like, well, the reason we call it backend TLS policy is this is when the service is used as a backend, this is the TLS details that you should use that are required to be able to complete a successful connection to it. So should use to connect to it is like a little bit funky, but because it's like, if you choose not to do it, then that's up to you, but it's not going to work. Like that's
and that's where I think there's some tension around, like, is this informative or is it actually intending to program the gateway? And I think some of that is unclear.
I mean,
when you get to some of the client side configuration.
Yeah, it's intended to inform the gateway as a client. Firstly, that it should use TLS to connect to that backend service, and that it should like if we want to make this more straightforward, the way to make this more straightforward is to put this thing into HTTP route backend ref and call it a day. And then I know what's going to happen is that everyone is going to come to me and complain, oh, why do we have to specify this 20 times when we have 20 different HTTP routes?
Well,
I will say because we did it with service and then everyone hated it.
Sure. The other big gotcha there is, of course, the problem of how many implementations can do this per path or per route config. Really, like that's yeah. But I get where you're going with it. Yes, I do.
And that's why I want to see, like, John has objections, that's cool, but like I'd like to see at least a sketch as to what his ideal solution looks like. And you can't just say Istio's destination route. Like, that's not okay. Like, I get it that's great, it's cool API, all that sort of stuff. But like, you need to fit the construct into what we have in Gateway API.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. That would help me a lot too. It's like I'm now, I think, starting to see the depth of some of these concerns, but I don't see an immediate pragmatic alternative. So yeah, that would help me as well.
Yeah. So I think John said something like, I didn't want to, start a whole nother gap. And I'm like, I don't want a whole nother gap. What I want is for John or anyone else who has objections here to sort of outline, in an ideal world, what would your solution look like? Where would this config live? How would you solve the issues that led to us picking this service? And which is why I'll spend some time today and put another comment on there that sort of outlines, here is why we picked service, right? Like, because that way, here are the issues that we needed to solve in order to pick service. If you want to do something different, then you need to answer the like why we pick service issues, right? Like to start with. So sorry, Rob, you've still got your hand up because somebody else.
Yeah, no, I know. There's a lot to say here. I'm trying to think how we can get unblocked here.
I mean, practically we can't get unblocked until John is back. Like, John has objections. He's away for 2 weeks. We can't, like he needs to answer those objections and he's not going to be able to for 2 weeks. So like, we can leave as much information and context on here as possible so that when John comes back, we can say, okay, please just drop a design sketch in here that explains like why you want to do things the way you want to do them and what it looks like. So that then we can actually have a productive discussion that's not, I don't like that because of this, right? Like, I get it, you don't like it, but I need to know what you want to do instead so that we can have a productive, like, where do we go from here style discussion.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think it's very clear that we want to move back NTLS forward in this release. I would really, really love to see it get to GA. It's been overdue. But my take, and I think I'm hearing it from others, is the onus has to be on John or someone to provide an alternative, right? Because what we seems to be stuck in right now is that we're in the least bad API that we can come up with today. If there's a better alternative, we should do that, but we also can't wait forever. We can't have backend TLS just continue to not exist, not be stable for years in the future. So yeah, with that, Candace, I think you're up next.
I just wanted to add one more point, because John brought it up in the thread that he thinks this is going to have an impact on all of the policies that apply to backends.
Yes.
So I think it's something. This is why I do think it's something that we need to clarify in the Gamma spec as well, because it really does. In my opinion, it does look at the way that we process services in a very different way. It has a front end and the back end, which is why this is I feel like which is why this has been problematic to get through in the first place, especially with the language that we use. I just feel like the Gamma spec is not clear enough for a standard V1 spec, and that is the thing that needs work in addition to whatever work we do to make sure that all policies that apply to backends aren't going to be questioned going forward for Gamma.
So yeah, I agree that there's definitely clarifications needed for Gamma. That said, one of the issues is around multiple implementations coexisting in a cluster. That's not exclusively a Gamma issue. You have the same issue if you have a GKE gateway and Envoy gateway running in the same cluster. Is this policy applicable to both is kind of the basic assumption. And then how is that handled? So that's where there's the scoping concern. And I think Rob has had separate issues on this in terms of trying to clarify the scope of a thing that does not inherently roll up to a gateway class. Like if you're targeting service, you lack the ability to roll up to a specific implementation of gateway API, whether that be a mesh in a north-south or 2 different north-south gateways in the same cluster. So like that issue, we do need to do something about. But I think that's it's related to Gamma, but it's not an issue of Gamma itself. There are issues of Gamma itself that sounds like need clarification around HTTP routes not being necessary. I thought that was explicit enough. Apparently it might not be.
How
Okay.
does everybody understand that? I know what you're talking about, Mike, but I'm not sure that
Yeah.
everyone else does.
I mean, I think that this is the classic problem with writing a specification is that however specific you think you have not been specific enough, right? Like it doesn't matter
Yeah.
how specific you have been, like someone is going to misread what you've written, right? Like, someone's going to miss something, someone's going to, and that's the point of the conformance tests is to lock that behavior in a code way
Exactly.
so that if your behavior is wrong, then your tests fail, right? Like that's the point of the conformance test is to remove some textual ambiguity from the specification and be like, specification says this, the conformance test that, and if you fail the conformance, then you're not doing things right. Go and read the specification again. So that's, and I think like, again, I've said this again, and I know there were very good reasons for us to move Gamma forward to GA. But like I think one of the biggest mistakes we made is that we did not have more conformance testing before we moved Gamma as a pattern to GA. We should have had more conformance testing of a few things, especially sort of the basic behavior things like, do you need a HTTP route or not?
Well, and I think that's like a case of where what is tested is the positive case of if you configure an HTTP route, it works. What is missing is basically like the empty space of if an HTTP route does not exist, like that's somewhat by definition like outside the scope of Gamma doing anything because that enrollment mechanism was never intended to be part of Gamma. The enrollment mechanisms that exist are specific to each implementation. So like the way that Linkerd annotates namespaces, the way Istio labels namespaces, like that mechanism, should it be part of Gamma? That's maybe an open question. But right now it is not, and it was not intended to be. But that's where the gap is. Sounds like.
Yeah. And I think the one last thing I wanted to say, like I think the point that John is making is fair, is that if there's problems, is that roll up problem that you mentioned, Mike. Like, I agree. It needs to be clearer defined. To me, the point of calling these things backend, blah 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 blah, was that they're intended to apply when that service the back end part of the service, the pool of endpoints, the endpoint selection pool functionality of a service is used, then as a backend for a HTTP route in some use case, then those things apply. That's why we picked the name backend, is because it's intended to apply only when it's used as a HTTP route, which then means that you do get roll up to a gateway class because it only applies when the HTTP route is in use, and the HTTP route always rolls up to something, right? And so like, again, it's a transitive roll up, right? Like in that, the backend TLS policy only applies when the service is used as a backend for a HTTP route. Therefore, in that case, like this is what I intended.
Yeah,
I'm not saying this is what we wrote
doesn't
down.
avoid the mesh issue though, of like you still have a service as a backend ref on an HTTP route. It's just that the HTTP route might or might not be required. Or sorry, the HTTP route is not required, but if it's there,
I mean,
and you have a service as a backend ref, like that reference still exists, and then I
mean, at the end of the day, again, it comes down to applications that need backend TLS policy are violating the central assumption of a service mesh, which is that the service mesh does TLS, right? Like, and they are not doing that. Like I think that is the key part. Like, is that this is not. That's why I've always been like, this is not for service mesh, because like it violates the key assumption here, which is that applications do not do their own TLS.
I mean, I would even be okay. Like my comments are in the spirit of trying to move this forward because I also have use cases for this. Like we have out of cluster north-south gateways that need some way to connect. So like my comments, like although they may seem concerning or trying to like echo similar issues, like I'm really trying to understand the issues that are there to help advance this forward. And maybe that's as simple as like application TLS policy or something like that, and really trying to clarify the scope better. I don't know, just and that's where I'm at. Like I see the issues, but I don't have a clear, better proposal, and I would like to see if there is something possible. So
I think
so like I said,
I will put some.
At this point, but
I will put some more historical context onto that issue as to why it's called what it is, why we picked service, and a bunch of other sort of decisions. Like this is why we decided it this way. You know, so that at least then that context is written down somewhere. Because again, like although we've tried to sort of preserve some of the context in the GEP, like you always lose some. Like this is the design process we went through. Context.
Yeah, I don't even mind the targeting service. I don't mind the name. It's just really around like the scope of like what's the expected behavior, and I think that's a little bit fuzzy. And in terms of that like server versus client configuration role.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I'll try and put some historical context on this issue today.
I'm realizing, I don't know, one of the things I can't help but call out here, this one, whatever I did here, it does not work anymore with Mermaid, which is sad. But the key thing in all our TLS terminologies, we have front end, gateway, and back end. Within that, there is basically a subset of gateway acting as a client and configuration for how it talks to the back end, and that like there's still sub items here. So I don't know, naming is difficult here, but calling something like backend TLS policy infers that it could potentially cover both of these lines, which anyway,
we need to rename it to server to application TLS policy or something like that to sort of be very clear about exactly what it's describing. Then that's fine. Like I do not care about the name. All I care about is that the functionality gets in and users who actually need the north-south part of the functionality get the functionality that they have been waiting like multiple years for at this point.
I want that too.
Okay, that's good to hear. And yes, +1, I just want to get this functionality in yesterday. And whatever name gives us the clearest path forward, least ambiguity is a huge win. I realize we've taken a lot of time on this, so I don't want to spend too much more time on it. It can give people back some time in their day. I think this is the last item on the agenda, but there are some very clear follow-ups here. So thank you, Nick, for volunteering to follow up on this. And yeah, we'll look forward to John being back, but also if people have some ideas in the meantime that can help smooth over, like I'm hoping whatever we do here is not just a complete rewrite of backend TLS policy, but more some tweaks and adjustments that make it clearer what the purpose of the API is, what the scope of the API is, and how it interacts with Mesh, instead of just trying to restart from scratch, because I don't think anyone wants that. Yeah. Okay. Any last items before we call it a day?
No, I'm good.
Great.
Looks like
All
a
right. Well,
chat from Ariane. Chat message.
yeah.
Sorry.
Got
So I
some
was just thinking
feedback,
about the
Ariane.
naming.
Yeah.
Can we just
Yeah.
say gateway backend TLS policy? It's quite understandable, right? We'll exclude the mesh use case from it.
That's one of the things I prefer to avoid is just like special casing it does not apply to mesh. I would rather like define the scope and say like, yeah, I think there's a little more nuance there of like, I want the scope to work and be understandable even if broken, rather than have it just be like, oh, this doesn't do mesh. Unless we have like a clear way to specify a secondary target like a gateway, like and that's one of the potential like enhancements here is some sort of secondary targeting mechanism, such that rather than a policy that directly targets the service like implicitly being applicable to anything that is in the cluster, any gateway API implementation cluster, of like and this only rolls up to this gateway, or these gateways or something like that. Like that secondary targeting might be a way to kind of narrow the scope here.
Is it
Yes.
fair to say that, this is interesting, and I like that idea, Aryan, or, you know, I think it's worth discussing a bit more. For the gateway for mesh specifically, do we imagine configuring backend TLS at all, or are we saying that this policy is just irrelevant? Because what gives me some concern right now is we're saying, or we're mostly saying, that the thing known as backend TLS policy today really only applies to north-south implementations, is what I'm hearing. And we
I
have
think-
other backend policies that apply equally to north, south, and east-west policies, implementations. And so this feels like it would be confusing. I don't know. If on the other hand we say, okay, we have a path, we want to support mesh here, we think this is going to be interesting or relevant to mesh, then we should absolutely like figure out how this can make sense for mesh and not mesh. But if we're saying, no, this will never make sense for mesh, then maybe a name that makes it clear this is not for mesh would be helpful.
So for me, if I can think of this policy so far, I think it makes more sense for the gateways. So think for this case, like the server is terminating the TLS and they use the custom server. Meshes have their own like MTLS by default, right? So if they have the application that is already doing the native TLS, the client in the mesh is already doing that, right? Mesh is adding a TLS on top of it. So this backend TLS policy doesn't make sense for mesh at this point.
I should pause for a second. I forgot to ask anyone if they wanted to introduce themselves at the beginning of this, but Aryan and Kartik are on the call today, and they both work on Mesh at Google and have been looking into how we can support backend TLS on that side. So just for a quick introduction and context.
Thanks.
Candace, you dropped a link in chat. What was the or is this old and I'm just...
No, that's Gateway Backend TLS. I'm sorry, yeah, Gateway Backend TLS is already
That is the
in
current
use.
setting for how you can tell the gateway that it should use a client certificate when connecting to backends. Right, so that again is a client setting rather than a server setting, and so that's why it's on gateway.
Yep.
Just would be a confusing name. I'm just putting out
Oh, well,
there.
to clarify, what
Because
I think
gateway
this...
backend TLS policy, and that thing is also going to move because yeah.
So okay,
That
so this
backend
fits
TLS thing is gonna
under... What is this under? Gateway.spec.backend TLS.client certificate. Okay. Yeah, that's confusing.
We have talked about moving this because changing that at least because that we want to be able to have other TLS settings that function at the whole of gateway level, which means that we can't just have backend TLS there. We need a TLS stanza that handles all TLS that operates at the whole gateway level, which will include the client certificate config, but could include other things like, when you're connecting as a client, only use minimum TLS versions, or other TLS settings.
Yeah, I feel like that maybe just got that slipped in there somehow. We didn't have a lot of I don't know, unless I'm not remembering how it got there. It's still experimental too, right?
Yeah, that was a follow-up. I'm trying to remember what release that came in, 1.1 or 2. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's an important thing, but it is confusing and kind of highlights what I was saying earlier, that we're using backend TLS as a term to refer to communication between a gateway and a backend, But within that bubble, we're not very clear of, is this referring to the client side of that or the server side of that? And
Yeah.
that could use help. Okay. And then good comment from Ian in chat, that being strictly prescriptive about how meshes handle this might be problematic. Which, okay, I'm trying. Does that mean we should?
That's why I want to get away from meshes must or can't do this, and instead like define what it does, and if that makes sense for some mesh and they're able to do it, then fine. I just really focus, and I think like the like secondary targeting thing is also like a way around that, of like, if you can specify this policy targets this service, but only in the context of requests coming from this gateway, that's a fine way to like totally avoid the like implications of universal policy for the service. And there's use cases in the inverse direction too, of like budgeted retries might only be applicable to your mesh. And if you have a north-south gateway in the cluster, what's it supposed to do if that policy exists?
Yeah. That makes sense.
I think it makes
Yeah.
clearer.
It just- You go in. You go. No, you go in.
I think it might make it clear for writing status as well. Like your mesh's gateway can write a status. I can't handle this traffic, or it can. Whereas otherwise, it doesn't know if it really should do that. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I've been reluctant to do sort of more secondary targeting for policies thing is there's already like 5 dimensions in which you have to consider whether a policy should attach. Adding a 6th one is kind of like, okay, like, we're just, we're further increasing the complexity budget of using a policy at all. If we really need to do it, then we'll do it. But like, I'm like, what's going to happen when you have a label selected policy that attaches to named sections of a gateway, but only applies in a certain gateway class, right? Like, does it apply or not? I don't know. You're going to have to go and like run like an AI model over your config to be able to figure out whether or not something works, something is taking effect, right? Like, that's the reason why I'm resistant to do. Okay, sure, let's just do that. Is that we already have a massive complexity budget problem when we're talking about any policy. And again, the only reason we're using policy for service is that it's very difficult to make spec changes to service. The right place to put something that describes an application, a TLS policy for connection to an application, is inside the service, inside the port. There should be a thing that says, use TLS for this port. Here's the TLS details you need to do for that port. We can't make changes to service because doing that takes 3 years if you can get if on the happiest possible path. Right, like if anyone argues with it at all, you're looking at 4 to 5 years, right? Like, and so, that's why we use a policy here, even though it really shouldn't be. Like, but changing core objects is really no bueno, because like it's too hard. Like, for like NP complete style hard, right? Like it's doable, but you spend way so much effort on it as to make it like, is that really worth it?
And to add to that, service is historically an L4 resource, and adding concepts that exist above L4 complicates that even further. What does kubeproxy do when it sees something that it has no idea what to do with? I don't know, right?
All of us, everybody who's involved in having anything to do with service in core is like, no more changes to service, no more additional features. We don't want service to be a thing anymore. We want to blow it up, right? Like, so it's not going to happen in that respect as well.
Yeah, and I agree with one other thing you said, Nick, that our complexity budget is too high, and I think we are overrepresented. And I don't mean this in a bad way, because I appreciate every implementation that is represented here. It provides valuable feedback, but what we really need is end users that can tell us, your thing is way too complicated. Please don't make it more complicated. And one risk of that is if we make it more ambiguous whether or not something is going to be supported by someone's implementation. That's something I'm really, really nervous about. So anyway, that's if we can have some really clear guidelines and very clear signaling, great. But I'm real nervous about, making something more ambiguous if it's just to enable some edge cases or, whatever that is, right? Maybe it's not, maybe
Yeah.
it may be significantly more than edge cases. I don't fully understand the scope, but I just want to make sure we have, a very clear path for this.
Yeah, I think it's like anything that targets a non-gateway API resource,
Yeah.
when there are multiple implementations in the cluster is going to have similar problems. And I think like I don't even hate the idea of policy attaching to service. I'm totally fine with that. I think that a useful way to think about framing this problem is if this was a field on service, what would that mean? Not saying that it should, but the same problems exist in that implementation as they do with this. And
Yeah.
we even like have better tools with policy in terms of like adding a secondary selector or something like that than we would on service. Like if you have a field that exists on service that says this is how you need to connect to me, like what does that logically play out to? Because you would have some of the same issues here.
Yeah.
I should note that
Okay.
we are currently out
Yeah.
of time.
We have blown through our budget. I apologize at the beginning for saying this would be a short meeting. My prediction accuracy for length of meeting has always been very, very poor. And today is no exception. But thanks everyone, and I'm sure we'll see you around. And thanks to Nick for agreeing to take some follow-ups here.
No problem.
Take care, y'all.
See ya.
Thank you.
Feel free to loop me in too, Nick.
Bye-bye.